Today I'm going to show you how to transfer a design to watercolor paper without using a light tracer. So I just have a red pencil for the sketch, and I have a #2 graphite pencil. I've got my reference here from Pinterest. A lot of people hate on Pinterest, but if you've got the eye, you can find some pretty good reference material on there. So I'm going to go ahead and just start the sketch on tracing paper, and I'll show you how to transfer it onto the watercolor paper. So here I'm just kind of basically hashing out the general shape of the design. I recommend just starting as light as possible. That way you can build up your sketch as you go along. And I was going for kind of a rattlesnake look, and I was trying to do the diamonds, and then I ended up not really liking the diamonds, and I just kind of switched them to the little blob spots that you see on traditional snakes a lot. And so now that I have the general kind of sketch going, I'm gonna do like sort of a final hard outline over the sketch that I can then follow to transfer it over to the watercolor paper. So now I've flipped the paper over, and I've got my pencil. It's not very sharp, it's pretty dull, as you can see, because I want to have kind of a fat line on the back side of the paper. And I'm using pretty firm pressure because I'm trying to deposit as much graphite onto the back side of the paper as possible. That way, when you flip the paper over and you retrace the design from the other side, it's going to leave an impression from the graphite that's on the back side of the design here. So here's what it looks like on the back side of the paper. And then here's what it looks like from the top of the paper. And it's so here I have it positioned where I want it to be, and you see I just folded the corners over, so I'm not even taping it down. So you don't even need tape to do this necessarily, although taping it down can be a little bit easier, so the design doesn't move around. And then I sharpen my pencil just a little bit. That way the line is a little bit smaller, and there's more pressure on the point of the pencil. And you're going to want to use firm pressure in order to transfer the graphite that's on the back side of the sketch onto the watercolor paper. And you don't want to use too much pressure because you don't want to dent the paper. It'll make it difficult to nib the design later on if there's like dents in the paper from the pencil. So I'm using just enough pressure to transfer some of that graphite onto the watercolor paper, but not so much pressure that it's going to dent the paper. And on some of this, I probably could use a little bit more pressure. You'll see once I reveal the impression that's left on the watercolor underneath. Some of the lines are a little faint, some of the lines are there, but for me it works as a guideline, so then I can go ahead and ink the design onto the watercolor. I like using this method even if I was going to use a light table to trace the design onto the watercolor paper, because you can then use this design and it will run through the Thermofax to make a tattoo stencil directly off of this sketch without having to re-outline it with a different marker or put it through the copy machine. The graphite will pick up on spirit paper in a Thermofax, so it's another cool way you can streamline your process and use less tools. So this is definitely a lot more work than just using a light tracer, or if you were going to put the watercolor paper up on the window and trace the design from the back of the watercolor paper onto the front. But It's a good exercise because you're getting a couple extra reps in of tracing the drawing. So it's going to be good for developing muscle memory and maintaining muscle memory. And I think it's good also as a warm up that you're really getting a lot of warm up before you go ahead and ink the design. Usually when I start drawing, I'm like a little bit shaky, but after about 20 minutes or so, I feel a lot more stable. And when you're doing the tracing on the backside of the tracing paper, depositing the graphite for the transfer, you also get a rep of doing the drawing mirrored of the way that you originally drew it. So it's going to work both sides of the design, you know, doing one version mirrored and one version, you know, the way that you drew it. Because if you're going to be doing this as a tattoo, depending on the placement of the body, the snake might have to face different ways. So it's good to develop your muscle memory doing a design mirrored as well as just straight on the way that you drew it in the first place. Okay, so here's the reveal, and you can see where I used good enough pressure and where I used maybe not quite enough. Some of the lines are a little bit more faint than others, but that's okay. And this is going to work just fine for a guideline for doing the final nib of the black outline for this painting. Okay, so I've got my B5 Speedball calligraphy nib here. That's what I'm going to be using for the outline. And for the black, I'm just using FW liquid acrylic. And I find that the FW liquid acrylic works pretty well for outlining with a nib on the hot press watercolor paper. On the cold press watercolor paper, it didn't seem to work as well in my past experience, but I haven't tried with the FW in a few years, and it seems like their formula is a little bit different. It's a little bit thinner, and it flows a little bit easier. So for hot press paper, it works just fine. Also, the hot press watercolor paper doesn't have the rough texture that cold press watercolor paper does. It's very smooth, and therefore it's a lot easier to use the nib on this paper because you can work in almost any direction and the paper doesn't catch the split in the nib as you're moving sideways. Sometimes it will catch a little bit and I'll feel it and I'll stop and I'll reposition myself and I'll try to get a better angle to make a smoother line. But for the most part, you can almost go any direction that you want as long as you're being careful and feeling what the nib is doing. It'll leave a pretty clean line. And sometimes in order to get like the best angle and of approach for the line that you're doing, you have to rotate the paper around. And this is a pretty large piece of watercolor paper and my desk is pretty small. So I'm kind of cramped in the corner, which is why I have to push down on the paper with my left hand here because the other half of the paper is getting like curled up from the edge of the desk. And I'm just trying to be careful to keep the tip flat on the paper so I get a even, consistent line. And also I'm being careful not to touch those lines I just did. And the nib is starting to run dry, so you can see the fangs, the line wasn't completely consistent there, but it's okay. It's fine. And right there you can see where I kind of lifted the edge of the nib on that tongue line, and you see it gets thinner and then thicker again. It's because I wasn't keeping the tip completely flat. And the next video, I'll paint the design, and so tune in for that one.